So this is hard, and I'm just gonna put that caveat out there. I'm gonna make some people mad, but I do it every week, and I'm okay with that. We got Georgia number one. I think that's pretty clear. They've got the best resume, and they've been dominant. They've now beaten two top six teams in dominant fashion. And so I think that also what we saw today sort of confirms that maybe the Oregon game wasn't a fluke, because we've all been trying to explain away that Oregon game was a fluke, but it just happened that Georgia went into SEC play, not tough SEC games, but went into SEC play, and Oregon went into play like they played Colorado today. Like they've played poor teams. They had to claw and fight from behind to beat Washington State. So I think that Oregon's look better. I've heard a lot of Bo Nix Heisman chatter and not the meme that's going around. That's a little off to me, but I've got Ohio State number 2 and Michigan number 3. This is really close. The thing that concerns me about Michigan is against Rutgers today. I think JJ McCarthy had like 5.6 yards per attempt, and there might have been some wind and some weather there too. But he is who he is. Point. 5.6. And my concern with Michigan is what happens when they don't hit a couple of 60-yard runs in a game. If a team can force them to run an offense, but I've got kind of the opposite concerns with Ohio State, Josh, and I've got them too, but I don't want to kill them for a ridiculous weather game against Northwestern, but Northwestern's 1-8. At some point, you've got to be able to have an offensive line that can take over and run the ball enough that it opens up short passing game for you that doesn't get impacted as much by the wind. The vertical game, I get it, but Ohio State couldn't control that game in the line of scrimmage and offense that's actually pretty putrid. I'm dropping Tennessee to number 4 ahead of TCU for exactly what you said earlier. I think Tennessee is a better team than TCU. I also saw something today that I think TCU has been trailing in the second half 4 times this year, and they've played injured quarterbacks in almost all of their games, played against injured quarterbacks in almost all their games. So I think that's telling. What will really be telling for all the people that are coming at me right now for not having TCU higher, because remember, this is kind of a combination power ranking too. We don't just rank like the AP. It'll be telling to see what current number 24 Texas is hosting TCU next week, what that point spread is. Because if that point spread is kind of tight, then that probably tells you that Vegas doesn't think that they're the third or fourth best team in the country. I've got Oregon at number 6. The one thing I like about Oregon, even though I think they've played a bunch of below average teams, is Oregon's handling their business other than that Washington State game. They're killing people. And that's something that USC is not doing. And that's why USC is further down my list. I've got LSU at number 7. They won that game today. I'm maybe a little more impressed with how bad they beat Ole Miss. But it's hard to ignore LSU at this point. And this is one where I do think that like bunch of transfers, new coaching staff, new quarterback explains why they lost to Florida State. I don't think anybody would pick Florida State on a neutral field if they played today. I've got USC number 8, and they're playing right now. It's 13-7 over Cal. I hope they beat Cal. Just so my top 10 doesn't look bad. And this is where everybody gets mad at me, Josh, and I don't care. It's my show. I can do what I want. I've got Alabama at number 9. And everybody's going to call me an SEC homer, but what I want people to do is look at what's beyond the top 10 right now, because you got to move somebody up. Are we moving Ole Miss up ahead of Alabama because Ole Miss has one fewer loss, hasn't played Tennessee, that beat LSU 40-13 right after losing by 3 touchdowns last week or 2 weeks ago? This LSU team that went to overtime with Alabama at home beat Ole Miss by 3 touchdowns. So, to me, when I'm looking at these two teams, there's no way that I think Ole Miss is better than Alabama. Now, Ole Miss might beat Alabama in a couple weeks or next week or whatever, but looking at what they've played throughout the year, Alabama's played 2 top 10 teams on the road, right? And that's a huge issue. I would argue that if Alabama got those 2 teams at home, they'd be undefeated right now, but they'd be a little bit like TCU in my mind. Like, I think they'd be a little bit of fool's gold at number 1. And so I got Alabama number 9. I don't think they're a great team, but Kansas State just lost at home to a team Alabama beat on the road, right? So we can't move them up, right? I've got UCLA number 10. This is one that maybe you could put ahead of Alabama. They did lose a couple weeks ago, but they handled their business last week. They've got a clean record. And honestly, I just don't know who else to put there. Utah, who lost to Florida, Penn State 6-2. Maybe 7-2 now. Illinois lost today to Michigan State. I just don't know what to do, Josh. Then like everything in my mind says that Alabama is not a top 10 team because of the issues they have with scheme, because I think they have issues at quarterback, but I just don't know who else to put there. And the performances that Alabama's put together in their losses don't get any closer. People keep talking about they're a few plays away from being 4-3 a couple weeks ago. They're 2 plays away from being undefeated. And I don't think they would be the best team in the country, but I think that matters for something if we're looking at the rest of the field. So for those of you that get at me in the comments, tell me who you would put ahead of Alabama at that 9th or 10th slot, because everybody lost today. And with that, Josh, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the same thoughts and comments. I mean, my number 1 team is Georgia. I think they have to be number 1 after beating Tennessee today. They've had a couple slow games, but those Kent State, Missouri games were kind of weird games where they turn the ball over, yada, yada. I'm not really necessarily making excuses for them other than the fact that a lot of teams have had slow games. And at least with theirs, you can say, yeah, well, if they didn't turn the ball over, it wouldn't have been close. You can say that with some confidence, really. And when they've put stuff together, and they kind of have most weeks this year, they've been dominant. And to control Tennessee is the most impressive win I think anybody has to this point. Tennessee's beating Alabama was the most impressive, but that's really, I think, fallen by the wayside in a number of different ways. So you've got to tip your hat to Georgia. My number 2 is Michigan, and my number 3 is Ohio State. Those 2 have to be there as the 2 undefeateds. And I'm going to go ahead and run through a bunch of super chats because the same concept is going to come up 100 times. Isaac Adkins says you can't take a stab at Stroud in that wind he played in. Uncle Rico says, are you seriously judging CJ Stroud in 30 to 50 mile per hour winds? Give me a break. Uptown Daniel says Ohio State won. We have a defense that wins now. That's what matters. But when you turn it around, Javari Williams said, I bet you guys $100 super chat we beat Ohio State. That's I think sort of a lot of stuff in a nutshell. Where a lot of people are at is people say, yeah, you can't judge Ohio State. We have the wind going on. We can't really throw the ball downfield. And, I was the one that tweeted out earlier today. It's amazing what happens when your first read is consistently open. That Haynes King was at 10.2 yards per attempt to begin the game. It was Texas A&M, so they had to make sure they had a hard stop before they hit 25 points and then just stayed there for the rest of the ball game against Florida. But Ohio State didn't have their first read open. They weren't playing Florida's defense. They were playing a defense that was playing quite well, and the wind was taking away the deep ball, so you couldn't leverage their athleticism. I get all that. But my point was, when that shot play isn't there, Ohio State didn't really have a counterpunch. And my thing with Michigan is they got some counterpunches. I mean, to Daniel's point, I'm a little worried about what Michigan is when they can't get these explosive runs. But what I do see for Michigan is when the game gets tough, Michigan can lean on you and grind on you, and they can pound the ball and they can run the ball well enough and get enough explosive plays that they can blow a game open like that. And defensively, they're pretty good and sound. I think Ohio State and Michigan are in similar in that regard. I don't know what it looks like when they play each other in a wide open game, in good weather. I can buy the argument that Ohio State could bomb away in Michigan. I can also buy the argument that Ohio State's offensive line hasn't always looked elite. They may get rendered one-dimensional, and the game could end up – I'm not saying it's going to get as lopsided as the game did, but, Michigan can win for a lot of the same reasons. Quaker Devil 08 had said apologies if already discussed, but do you see a scenario where Ohio State and Michigan both get in? Also, ignore some of the Homer Ohio State takes. And I would do agree with them. I think most Ohio State fans are reasonable, but yeah, I mean, there's very much a reality in play where Michigan and Ohio State could both get in, and it's very deserved. Those two teams are way head and shoulders better from a consistency standpoint than just about anyone else, including anyone in the Big Ten. My concern, and the thing that I keep espousing, is the Big Ten has so many teams that are so limited in one way or another, particularly the ability to throw the ball deep. It makes evaluating Ohio State and Michigan hard. It does not mean Ohio State and Michigan can't defend the deep pass. It just means I don't really know. And that answer is a big part of how I'd want to rank them 2 and 3. And beyond that, it's really subjective. It gets a little more interesting / difficult from this point on. I have Tennessee number 4 ahead of TCU at number 5. Sort of the same concept. I think Tennessee's offense is as good or better than TCU's. I have watched TCU a lot. Their defense is not good. No. It's not good. Texas Tech had plays against busted coverage where they're running wide open down the field. Texas Tech is a scrappy team that's given a lot of people problems this year. They're not a great team. And TCU, we were talking about it earlier in our show, is consistently winning these games by like 10 points. They're never really in command. I think they're kind of been the beneficiary of playing what is not an overly tough schedule without having played Texas yet, without having played Baylor yet. They played a lot of teams with backup, with dinged up quarterbacks or injury situations. I'm not a huge fan of TCU, but they're undefeated. And the way we do our top 10 is to say, how did you do against your schedule? And how would the team behind you have done with the same schedule? Or, or vice versa, right? How would you have done with their schedule? I don't think TCU is undefeated in the Big Ten or SEC. In fact, I think they have multiple losses in those conferences, just from my view of having watched them. I do give them credit because they've been able to win consistently, which is not something everyone's done. But they haven't looked pretty in doing it. They just have played a lot of teams where you could get away with it. And that's kind of how I just try to parse it mentally because it's the only way you can do it. My number 6 team is Oregon. Oregon continues to look pretty good. They've played good football. They really ran away with the game today, again, against a bad opponent. But still, I think you can chalk up some of that week 1 game to be week 1 jitters, new coaching staff. But I also, in the back of my mind, go, you know what? I've seen Bo Nix against Georgia enough times to see him look like that a lot. And I think there may be something there to the fact that may just be where the gap is between the Pac-12 and some of these other major conferences, or at least the elite teams in those conferences. And so I'm kind of skittish on Oregon, but they've been good enough and consistent enough. There's no way I can put them really any lower than 6 in this field. Southern Cal is 7. Same discussion. Losing to Utah in a game where they very easily could have won that game, kind of a weird end too. That's not great given that Utah lost to Florida. I think Utah is a slightly better team than Florida. I think they're a better team than Florida, win that more often than not. But Florida's a bad team and has been a bad team in the SEC. So losing that game is not good. But I also don't know what USC's really accomplished to this point in the year to really warrant it. But again, you got 1 loss, and I can't really drop you too much for that. They're playing right now. They're up on Cal. If they lose that game, so be it. That happened when they lost to Utah. But, that just is what it is. You can slot somebody else up in the 10th slot, and they would fall out of the top 10 if they lost another game. My number 8 is LSU. They have 2 losses, and I can't put them a whole lot higher than that. They have been, for the past several weeks, one of the best teams in college football. I talked about earlier that Tennessee game was a bit, you can point to it being a bit of a fluke because they lost their left tackle to illness the morning of the game. They lost their left guard, I think, right around the end of the first quarter. And their offensive line collapsed, and Tennessee blew them out because the offense they were absolutely hemorrhaging penetration on every play. And that meant they kept giving the ball back to Tennessee, and everything just sort of started piling up on LSU. Other than that game, though, they've looked really good. Blowing out Ole Miss is probably a pretty big deal. Beating Alabama is a pretty big deal. That is a very good LSU team. This is where I have the same problem that Daniel has. My number 9 is Alabama, because you can rag on them all you want, talk about how bad they are. They lost to a legit top 10 team, and they lost to a legit top 5 team.
On the last play of the game for both of them.
The last play of the game for both of them.
On the road.
And if you want to look at who's left in this list and tell me who you want to put higher, I mean, maybe UCLA. It's tough. I can't really put Ole Miss ahead of them given where Ole Miss is at. And everybody else that you want to list probably has 2 losses. So you've got to. I think Alabama is the best 2-loss team, and the best 2-loss team probably going to end up number 9. And number 10 is tough, and this is sort of an example of it. My number 10 right now was Clemson. I don't think Clemson's a great team. They've got 1 loss. I think they've won a lot of games against teams like Wake Forest that aren't that great in close games at the end of regulation. I do think the ACC may be a little better than we want to give them credit for. But, if Clemson was to play UCLA in a neutral field, who would I pick to win? If UCLA played Clemson's schedule, would I think they only had 1 loss? I kind of think Clemson would do better if they traded schedule. So I've got them 10. And you're going to have a lot, people are going to disagree with that. But to Daniel's point, you've got to write out a top 10 and realize the fall off, as often happens, particularly in resume, from about number 6 on, is steep. And the pickings, we started about having this big group from like number 4 to number 25. That group's kind of expanded due to things like LSU winning this game against Alabama up to about 8 teams. And now the group behind them all have major warts. So, yeah, I have Alabama 9, Clemson 10. And I'll note, I don't want to go off on a rant because we do it enough, but I want to note, this is why I don't want a 12-team playoff.
Right.
Because Alabama should not be in the playoff.
Right.
With who they are. If you make this a 12-team playoff, Alabama and Clemson 100% are going to end up in the playoff.